The restaurant was Gerald's choice, as most things had been for 45 years. Chez Laurent sat at the top of the Harrington Hotel, 42 floors above the city, the kind of place where the sommelier knows your name and the menu carries no prices. Gerald held a standing reservation for the second Saturday of every month. He brought clients there, closed deals over duck confit and aged Bordeaux, and occasionally when he remembered that he had a wife he brought me. I wore the navy dress he had always liked. Pearl earrings that had been my mother's. My hair arranged the way I'd worn it for decades, silver now where it had once been chestnut brown. 67 years old, and I had dressed with the same care I'd shown at 22, when Gerald Preston had asked me to marry him across a table just like this one, in a restaurant just like this one, in a world that felt full of possibility. The maitre d' seated us at the window table. The city spread out below, glittering and indifferent. Gerald ordered the wine without consulting me, a Chateau Margaux from 1978, the year we were married. He had ordered it ahead of time. He had planned this evening carefully. I noticed that too. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. 45 years of marriage teaches you how to read a person. The particular set of Gerald's shoulders when he was rehearsing something in his head. The way he checked his phone twice in 3 minutes, and then slipped it back into his jacket pocket with a small, satisfied motion. The careful distance he kept across the table, close enough to appear attentive, far enough to feel like a departure already in progress. I had spent 7 months reading him this way, and by now I knew the shape of every sign. We ordered. The first course arrived. Gerald made conversation about the office expansion he had been overseeing, about the new associates who impressed him, about a conference he'd attended in San Francisco the previous month. I listened. I asked the right questions. I smiled at the appropriate moments. At the adjacent table, a man in a charcoal suit was finishing his appetizer alone. He had arrived before us, which was part of the arrangement. He sipped sparkling water and kept his attention on his plate with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to waiting. His name was James Whitfield. He had been my attorney for 11 weeks. Gerald didn't know that. Gerald didn't know much, as it turned out, about the woman sitting across from him in the restaurant he had chosen for their 45th anniversary. The entrees arrived. The city hummed 42 floors below. And then Gerald set down his fork, the way a man does when he has finally decided to say the thing he has been carrying around for months, and he reached for his wine glass and he said, "Catherine, there's something I need to tell you." I folded my hands in my lap. "I know," I said. He stopped. "I've known for 7 months, Gerald." My voice was steady. It had taken considerable time and effort to make it that steady. "I know about Diane. I know about the apartment on Marlowe Street. I know about the account in the Cayman Islands that you opened in February, and the one in Delaware that predates it by 3 years." I paused. "I know about a great many things." The color left his face in a way I had never seen in 45 years of watching it. "The gentleman at the table behind you," I continued, "is James Whitfield of Whitfield, Moore & Associates. He has been my attorney since April. He is here as a witness to this conversation, and to the delivery of certain documents that I believe you will want to review before we leave this restaurant tonight." Gerald turned. James gave him the courteous, composed nod of a professional doing his job. The divorce filing was completed Thursday. I lifted my water glass and took a measured sip. "I chose tonight because you chose tonight, and I thought it was fitting that we both have an occasion. 45 years. And the look on Gerald Preston's face in that moment was the first truly honest expression I had seen from him in at least 7 of them. "My name is Catherine Preston. I was born Catherine Hale in a small house on Birchwood Lane in Millhaven, Ohio, the eldest daughter of a pharmacist and a schoolteacher who believed, with the absolute conviction of their generation, that education was the only inheritance worth leaving. My father spent his life building a library in our front room, one wall of floor-to-ceiling shelves that smelled of wood polish and old paper. My mother kept a grade book at the kitchen table well into July, working through the fall lesson plans while my sisters and I ran through the yard in the last of the summer heat. I was accepted to Columbia Law School in the spring of 1977. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. I remember setting it on the kitchen table and staring at it for a long time before I let myself believe what it said. I had wanted to be an attorney since I was 14 years old and watched my uncle lose his small construction business to a contract dispute that a competent lawyer could have resolved in an afternoon. I watched that happen and thought, that will never happen to someone I love because of something I failed to understand. That thought lived in me for years, quiet and determined, while I worked my way through Ohio State on academic scholarships and late-night waitressing shifts, while I studied for the LSAT in the break room of the diner where I worked weekends, while I sent applications to every law school in the country with the methodical persistence of someone who had been underestimated her whole life and had decided to be efficient about proving people wrong. Columbia said yes. 3 others said yes as well. Columbia was where I wanted to go. I met Gerald Preston that June, at a garden party given by mutual friends at a house in the Hudson Valley. He was 29, already working at his father's investment firm, confident in the way of men who have never been told they couldn't have something. He was handsome in a conventional way, broad-shouldered, good teeth, the kind of laugh that fills a room and makes the people in it feel included. He had a talent for making you feel, when he looked at you, like the most interesting person in his immediate vicinity. I was 22. I was going to law school in September. By August he had asked me to marry him. I said yes. I will not pretend all these years later that it was anything other than what it was. I was 22 and I was in love, and the feeling of being chosen by someone so sure of himself felt, at that age, like a kind of safety I hadn't known I was looking for. My mother cried at the kitchen table when I told her, not entirely from happiness. She understood what I was giving up before I did. You can defer, she said. Columbia will wait a year. We've talked about it, I told her. Gerald's firm is in New York. I can still apply next year. It's only a year. My mother looked at me with the particular expression of a woman who has watched enough years pass to know what they take with them. She didn't argue. She helped me plan the wedding. The year became 2 years and 2 years became 5. Gerald's father retired, and Gerald stepped into the firm with both feet, and the demands on his time multiplied in the way that career demands do, quietly and constantly, until they fill everything around them. We lived in a brownstone in the West Village that his parents had helped purchase. We had dinner with clients twice a week. Gerald traveled to Boston and Chicago and London on schedules that shifted without notice, and there were 100 small emergencies and arrangements and social obligations that fell to me to manage, as they fall to wives, as they had always fallen to wives, with the unspoken understanding that someone needs to hold the fabric of a life together while someone else builds the career that justifies that life. I deferred twice. Then I withdrew my Columbia application entirely. I told myself I would apply again in a few years when things had settled, when Gerald was more established, when the timing was better. The timing was never better. When our daughter Elise was born in 1981, I stopped framing it as a delay and started framing it as a choice. People do that. They find the more livable story, and they tell it to themselves until it becomes the one they believe. I chose my family. I chose this life. I chose Gerald. Those statements were true. They were not the complete truth, but they were true enough to function. Elise was followed by our son Michael 3 years later. I threw myself into being a mother with the same focused intensity one had once directed at bar exam preparation. I read everything. I attended every school meeting, every recital, every pediatric appointment. I tutored Michael through his learning difficulties with a patience and a strategy that 3 different specialists told us was exceptional. I built a home that was, by every visible measure, warm and stable and full of care. And I ran Gerald's world. Not his business exactly, though I understood it well enough to catch the errors his associates sometimes missed, which I would point out to Gerald quietly and which Gerald would then mention in meetings as if the observations had occurred to him in the shower. I ran the rest of it. The household, the social calendar, the relationships with clients and their wives that required cultivation and maintenance, the charity commitments that polished Gerald's reputation in the circles where reputation mattered, the birthday cards and anniversary gifts and Christmas arrangements that kept professional relationships warm, the school applications and tutor searches and summer program enrollments that kept our children competitive in the world Gerald's ambitions had placed us in. It is not dramatic work. It doesn't appear on any resume. No one writes a magazine profile about the woman who remembered that Gerald's most important client lost his father in March and always needed a thoughtful call that month, Or who noticed that the managing partner's wife had mentioned an interest in a particular gallery opening and arranged for Gerald to send tickets with a handwritten note. No one measures that labor or assigns it a dollar value or considers, when the partnership comes through or the deal closes, what portion of it belonged to the invisible architecture of the marriage. I knew what it was worth. I had run the numbers in my head for 20 years before I started running them on paper. But I am getting ahead of myself. For most of our marriage, I was not thinking about any of this. I was living it. The days were full in the way that days in a well-run household are full, constantly, with enough purpose to mistake busyness for satisfaction. I had friends I liked. I had my children, whom I loved with a fierceness that surprised me. I had my garden, my reading, my occasional volunteer work at the legal aid clinic that was the closest I got to the law career I had set aside. I had Gerald, who was not an unkind man, not in those years, not on the surface. He was distracted and often absent and took things for granted in the way that people do when they have always had things, but he was not cruel. He said he loved me on the occasions he said anything about it at all. He came home. I told myself that was enough. For a long time I believed it. The first sign was not what you might imagine. It was not lipstick or a name in a phone or a hotel receipt left carelessly in a jacket pocket. Those are the signs of amateurs, and Gerald had always been a careful man. The first sign was a change in his attention. People who have been married for decades develop a sensitivity to each other's attention, the way you develop sensitivity to any constant in your environment. You stop noticing it when it's there, and you notice immediately when it shifts. Sometime in the late summer of 2022, Gerald's attention shifted. He was still present in the physical sense. Still at dinner, still in his chair at the head of the table, still making conversation about the markets and the news and the restaurant Michael was apparently planning to open in Portland. But the quality of his presence changed. His eyes, when I spoke, moved to a point slightly beside me, as if something just over my left shoulder had become more interesting. His responses arrived a half-beat late, the way they do when someone is listening with one part of their mind while another part is somewhere else entirely. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I filed the observation away and kept watching. By October, there were other things to file. He began carrying his phone in his breast pocket rather than leaving it on the kitchen counter the way he had for years. He started going to the gym at hours that didn't match his stated schedule. He mentioned twice in 3 weeks a restaurant I had never heard of in the Flatiron district, each time attributing the recommendation to a different colleague. He started being slightly more attentive to me in the deliberate, guilty way of a man who has read somewhere that neglecting your wife is a warning sign. That attentiveness was, in its way, more confirming than any receipt. I am a woman who was trained to read evidence before I abandoned that training. Old habits do not entirely leave you. They go quiet and they wait. I began paying attention in ways that left no trace. I reviewed the household credit card statements with more care than usual. Gerald's personal finances had always been separate from mine, his argument being that a business requires clean lines between personal and professional spending, which is a reasonable argument and one I had accepted for decades without examining what it was allowing him to conceal. I had a household account he funded monthly, a generous amount that covered our expenses and allowed me a personal allowance that was more than sufficient. I had never questioned it. I questioned it now. What I found in that first review was nothing obvious. Gerald was too experienced to leave obvious things. What I found was a pattern. The credit card statement showed regular charges to vendors I recognized and irregular charges to vendors I didn't. All of them in amounts small enough to be unremarkable individually, all of them repeating monthly with the regularity of standing commitments. A florist in the East 60s, billed the third week of every month. A wine merchant in Tribeca whose name I didn't recognize. A subscription service whose business category was listed only as concierge services. I wrote them down. I sat with them for 2 weeks. Then I called a private investigator whose name I had found through a woman at my legal aid clinic who handled family law cases. His name was David Park, 43 years old, formerly with the NYPD, currently the kind of professional who understands that his clients are not in a good place when they call him and who conducts himself accordingly. He was efficient and courteous. We met at a coffee shop on the Upper West Side. He listened while I described what I had observed, asked a few precise questions, told me what his services would cost, and I said yes without hesitating. 6 weeks later, David Park delivered a report that told me things about my husband of 44 years that I had not entirely been prepared to know, despite having prepared for them. Her name was Diane Hartley, 41 years old, Director of Strategic Communications at a financial services consulting firm. Gerald had met her, David's report indicated, at a conference in Chicago in February of 2019, which meant the affair was not 7 months old, as I had suspected, but 3.5 years old. 3.5 years. She was 26 years younger than Gerald and 26 years younger than me. She had dark hair cut short above the collar, and a way of walking in the photographs David had taken that suggested someone accustomed to being looked at. The apartment on Marlowe Street in the West Village was a 2-bedroom in a recently built tower, leased since March of 2020 in the name of a company Gerald had registered in Delaware called Harrington Advisory Services LLC, a name chosen, I noted, to be confusable with the hotel where we had spent our honeymoon. That detail may have been coincidence. Did not feel like coincidence. I sat with David Park's report for 3 days before I showed it to anyone. I sat with it the way you sit with a difficult diagnosis. You need time to let it settle into the body before you can begin thinking about what comes next. I had given Gerald Preston 44 years. I had given him my Columbia Law acceptance letter, my career, my early 20s, the years when a woman builds the independent foundation she will need for the rest of her life. I had given him my name and my children and 2 decades of labor that no one had ever measured or valued or acknowledged. I had given him all of this. And he had given me a 3.5-year secret life with a woman in a West Village apartment named after our honeymoon hotel. I cried on the first night. I will say that plainly because the women who watch these stories deserve honesty. I cried quietly, alone in the bathroom with the door locked, for a long time. 44 years of a life doesn't become small just because it held betrayal. The grief was real. I let myself have it. Then on the morning of the 4th day I called James Whitfield. I had done my research before I called. James Whitfield had been a partner at Whitfield, Moore and Associates for 11 years, specializing in high-net-worth matrimonial law. His record was precise and his reputation was for leaving nothing uncounted. He had represented 3 women in my circle over the years, none of whom had told me until years after the fact, which tells you something about how women protect each other's dignity even when they are not in a position to say why. James answered his own phone on the 2nd ring. "Mr. Whitfield," I said. "My name is Catherine Preston. My husband is Gerald Preston of Preston Capital Management. I believe I need your help." "Tell me about your situation, Mrs. Preston." I told him. I was brief and organized and I had my notes in front of me. I told him what I had observed, what David Park had found, and what I believed the financial situation to be. I told him about the Delaware company and the Cayman account I had found referenced in a document that Gerald had not realized I'd seen, a wire transfer confirmation that had come through the household fax machine in error the previous spring, which I had photographed and filed without mentioning to him. James Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've been thorough." "I was trained to be," I said. We met the following week. He brought 2 associates and a forensic accountant named Patricia Ng, who would spend the next 9 weeks tracing the financial history of Gerald Preston's marriage with the methodical attention the work deserved. What Patricia Ng found across those 9 weeks was a full accounting of a financial life that Gerald had been running in parallel to our shared one for somewhere between 7 and 10 years. The Delaware LLC was the most recent vehicle. Before it, there had been arrangements routed through Preston Capital itself, through bonuses restructured as consulting fees paid to entities that existed on paper only. The Cayman account held somewhere in the range of $4.2 million, accumulated through transfers small enough to avoid automatic reporting thresholds and timed carefully enough to be difficult to trace without the kind of forensic attention Patricia brought to the task. There was also the matter of Preston Capital itself. Gerald had founded the firm in 1985 with an initial investment of $300,000, of which $180,000 had come from the sale of a piece of property in Millhaven, Ohio, that had been left to me by my maternal grandmother. Gerald had presented the use of those funds as a joint investment in our future, which at the time I had accepted. I signed documents. I did not have an attorney review those documents because I was 29 years old and it was 1985 and the man I had married was asking me to trust him, and I had not yet learned everything I subsequently learned about the cost of that kind of trust. Patricia had found those documents. She found the original incorporation papers, the early capital records, the structure of ownership agreements that Gerald had arranged in the years when I was raising children and managing a household and not asking questions about the business. She found, in the granular history of Preston Capital Management, a record of contribution and exclusion that told a story as clearly as any deposition. "You have a viable ownership claim," James told me at our meeting in late March. "Not a majority interest, but a meaningful one. Combined with the marital asset picture, you're looking at a very different conversation than a standard settlement." "I'm not interested in a conversation," I said. "I'm interested in what is accurate and what is fair." James looked at me with the particular expression of an attorney who has just understood something about a client. "You've thought about this for a while." "I've thought about a great many things for a while." I folded my hands on the conference table. I deferred my Columbia Law acceptance in 1977 to marry Gerald Preston. I would like you to build a case that reflects what that deferral was actually worth over the course of 45 years. There was a pause. "That," said Patricia quietly, looking up from her notes, "is going to be a significant number." I allowed myself in that moment one small smile. "I know," I said. The months that followed were the strangest of my life. I continued to live as I had always lived. I prepared dinner. I attended the charity functions on the calendar. I flew to Portland in May for Michael's restaurant opening and told Gerald it had been wonderful, which it had been, and I didn't mention anything about what was happening in the offices of Whitfield, Moore and Associates, because there was nothing to mention yet. Nothing that needed Gerald's awareness before I was ready. That might sound cold to you. I want to explain why it wasn't. There is a particular kind of calm that arrives when you have made a decision after long deliberation. Not the numb quiet of someone holding themselves together by force. Something deeper than that. Something that comes from having looked honestly at a situation and decided, without flinching, what it requires. I had spent 45 years making myself smaller than I was. Accommodating. Adjusting. Finding the more livable story and telling it to myself until I believed it. I had bent myself into the shape of Gerald Preston's wife and held that shape so long it had started to feel like my natural form. These months of preparation were the first time in decades that I was operating at my full capacity, and whatever grief I carried for the marriage, there was something else running alongside it, something that felt less like loss and more like a door beginning to open after a very long time. I did not hate Gerald. I want to be clear about that. Hatred requires a certain quality of continued investment, a need for the other person to understand their wrong and feel it. I had moved past that. What I felt toward Gerald Preston in those months of preparation was something closer to the focused clarity of a woman who understands the complete picture and is ready to act on it. I made sure the children knew nothing during those months. Elise was in Philadelphia with her family. Michael was absorbed in the restaurant. They would need to be told eventually, but not before the legal groundwork was complete, not while everything was still in motion. I protected them the way I had always protected them, without letting them know they were being protected, which is a skill that mothers develop without being taught. Gerald made his move in June. I had been expecting it. Patricia had flagged a pattern in the financial movement suggesting he was preparing to initiate something. A restructuring of certain assets, the kind that happens before a divorce filing when the party with the financial complexity wants to establish a particular narrative before the opposing counsel has established theirs. He was, I recognized, doing what I was doing, and he had no idea I had been doing it for 3 months before he started. He came to me in the kitchen on a Wednesday evening while I was reading, and he said that he thought we needed to talk, that he had been feeling uncertain about the future for a while, that he wanted to be honest. His voice had the careful cadence of a rehearsed speech, the version where the speaker has positioned himself as reluctant and thoughtful rather than conclusive. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "When did you want to have this conversation?" "I was thinking this summer," he said. "Maybe after the anniversary dinner. I thought we should mark the occasion first." 45 years, and he wanted to mark the occasion before dismantling it. I found that, in a bleak way, very Gerald. "The anniversary dinner," I said. "Chez Laurent. 2nd Saturday of August." "That sounds fine." He looked relieved, the way people look when they expect resistance and don't encounter it. "I appreciate your being reasonable about this, Catherine." "I've always been reasonable," I said, which was true, and which was also in its own way the problem and which neither of us acknowledged. After he left the kitchen, I called James Whitfield. "He wants to do it at the anniversary dinner," I said. "Then we'll be ready," James said. We were ready. The August evening arrived. I wore the navy dress. I had my mother's pearls. I sat across from Gerald Preston at the window table of Chez Laurent, and I ate the first course, and I made conversation, and I watched the city glitter 42 floors below, and I did not betray, by any expression or inflection or gesture, anything that I knew. Because here is what I have learned, in 67 years and 45 of them married to a man who underestimated me. The most powerful position you can hold in any negotiation is the one where the other party doesn't know you're negotiating. Gerald set down his fork. He reached for his wine glass. He said, "Catherine, there's something I need to tell you." And I said, "I know." The look on his face. James Whitfield, at the adjacent table, set down his sparkling water with the quiet, precise movement of a man who has spent a career being exactly where he needs to be at exactly the right moment. Gerald looked from me to James and back to me, and in his eyes I could see the full shape of his miscalculation arriving all at once. The careful arrangement he had made, the speech he had rehearsed, the financial positioning he'd spent months constructing, the narrative he had planned to introduce into the space between entree and dessert. All of it encountering the simple, devastating fact that the woman across the table had gotten there first. "How long?" he said finally. 7 months of certainty, I said. Several years of suspicion. He was quiet for a moment. "The city moved below us." "I didn't think you knew." "No," I agreed. "You didn't." James rose from his table and walked the short distance to ours. He set a folder in front of Gerald with the unhurried movement of someone who knows exactly what the papers inside will do when read. Gerald opened it after a long moment, with the careful, slow turn of a man afraid of what he's about to find. The divorce filing. The asset disclosure request. The documentation of Harrington Advisory Services, LLC. The Cayman account records. The original incorporation papers for Preston Capital Management, with my grandmother's $180,000 clearly traced from the 1979 property sale to the 1985 capital contribution. Gerald looked up from the folder. His face had changed in a way I had not seen before, not in 45 years of watching it. Something had gone out of it, the particular confidence of a man who has always controlled the terms of the situation. What remained was something more ordinary and more honest. "You have been planning this," he said. "I have been planning this," I confirmed. He looked at James. "And you are?" "James Whitfield, Mrs. Preston's attorney." James handed him a card. "I suggest you contact your own counsel this evening. We have several matters that will need to be addressed on an expedited timeline." Gerald looked back at me. The Chateau Margaux sat between us, open and untouched in its decanter, the year of our marriage breathing in the warm restaurant air. "The whole dinner," he said. "You sat through the whole dinner knowing all of this." "I did." "While knowing all of this?" "Yes." Something crossed his face that I had not anticipated and which I found, despite everything, unexpectedly difficult to witness. Not anger. Something older and smaller than anger. Something that looked in its way like recognition. "I should have known," he said. "I always underestimated you." "Yes," I said. "You did." We sat there for a moment, the three of us, with the city below and the year of our marriage open between us and 45 years of everything we had been to each other, and everything we had failed to be, arranged around the table like guests who had arrived uninvited. Then Gerald closed the folder. He did not storm out. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene in the restaurant he had chosen. He simply nodded at James with the reluctant respect of one professional acknowledging another's work, and he straightened his jacket, and he looked at me one last time with an expression that was complicated in ways I did not yet have words for. "I'll call Martin tonight," he said. Martin Holloway was his attorney. "That would be wise," James said. Gerald Preston pushed back his chair. He left his wine unfinished. He walked across the restaurant with the careful, measured gait of a man who is working very hard not to show anything on his face, and he passed through the door and he was gone. The maitre d' appeared at my elbow with the practiced discretion of the very best restaurant staff. "Shall I bring the dessert menu, Mrs. Preston?" I looked at James, who had settled into the chair across from me with the quiet composure that I had come to understand was simply who he was. "Yes," I said. "I believe we'll have dessert." Outside, the city went on doing what cities do in the evening, moving, glittering, indifferent to the particular turns that particular lives take in particular rooms. Down below, Gerald Preston was probably already on his phone to Martin Holloway, already beginning the recalibration, already working through the shape of what the next months would require. Up here, 42 floors above it all, I sat with a folder of documents that told the true story of my marriage, and I ordered the tart tatin, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt entirely, completely myself. The process that follows a moment like that one is not cinematic. No one tells you, when you are watching stories about women who reclaim their lives, about the weeks of interrogatories and document production and conference calls with forensic accountants. No one describes the experience of having your marriage itemized in spreadsheets, each asset valued and dated and assigned to a column. No one talks about the particular grief of discovering, in the granular financial record of a shared life, exactly how little of it was shared in the ways that mattered. But the process is necessary. It is the mechanism by which something invisible is made visible and counted. My first meeting with James and Patricia after the dinner was the following Tuesday. Gerald had retained Martin Holloway, as expected, and Martin was, James told me with professional evenness, a capable adversary. The preliminary exchange of financial disclosures had begun. "How are you feeling?" James asked at the start of that meeting, which was not a question I had expected from him. "Focused," I said. And then, because it was true, "Better than I expected." He nodded. "That's common at this stage. The clarity of having moved tends to be steadier than the anticipation of moving." He was right. The 7 months of preparation had been harder, in many ways, than the dinner itself. Holding the knowledge while continuing the daily surface of the marriage, making decisions about when and how to act, managing the grief while building the case. The dinner had been, in its way, a release. The moment when the private truth became the public record, when careful preparation became the actual event. Now the event was underway, and I had work to do. The ownership claim in Preston Capital was the most significant element. James had spent considerable effort establishing the chain from my grandmother's property to the initial capital contribution, and Patricia's forensic work had traced the firm's financial history with a thoroughness that would be difficult to dispute. The argument was not that I deserved the current value of the firm, which was substantial. The argument was that I had been a contributing party in the founding and early development of the business, and that my contributions, both financial and operational, had been systematically excluded from the record of ownership while being essential to the record of success. Gerald's attorneys would contest this. They would argue that my role had been voluntary, that I had signed documents knowingly, that the contribution from my grandmother's property had been a gift and not an investment. They would argue these things with the resources and sophistication that a man who has spent 40 years building a wealth management firm can deploy in a contested divorce. But James Whitfield had spent 20 years representing women in exactly this position, and he had built a case that I found, reading through it in his conference room on that Tuesday morning, genuinely precise. "You said you were trained to be thorough," James said, setting down the final exhibit. "I've been doing this work for a long time, Catherine. You prepared the most complete initial record of any client I've had." I thought of my mother's library, her grade book at the kitchen table, the particular quality of attention she brought to everything she did. I thought of the Columbia acceptance letter on the kitchen table in 1977, and the long winding route that had brought me here. I had good teachers, I said. The weeks ahead would bring discoveries I was not entirely prepared for and confrontations I had not anticipated. Gerald's response to the filing would be more complicated than I expected, and in some ways less. The children would need to be told, and those conversations would be harder than any of this. Diane Hartley would enter the proceedings in ways that changed the emotional shape of things without changing the legal shape, which is its own kind of education. And there would be a morning several months from now, when I would stand in a different room and look at documents that told the story of a different kind of inheritance than the one I had spent 45 years expecting, and I would understand fully and finally what those 45 years had actually been worth. But that morning was still ahead of me. For now, it was enough to sit in James Whitfield's conference room with a cup of coffee going cold beside my notes, doing the work I had always been trained to do. knowing with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally stopped telling herself the more livable story that the truth she had spent a lifetime circling had run out of places to hide. Martin Holloway filed a motion to compel discovery on a Thursday morning, 14 days after the anniversary dinner, and James called me before 9 to walk me through what it meant. It meant Gerald had made his decision quickly. He was not going to try to negotiate early. He was going to fight. He's requesting a full accounting of your personal finances going back 20 years, James said. Every account in your name, every transaction, any income you may have received. I've had a household account and a personal savings account, I said. He funded both. He knows exactly what's in them. He knows what's in them, James agreed. The motion is a message. He wants you to understand that this process will be thorough and uncomfortable, and that he has the resources to make it long. Martin Holloway was a litigation attorney with a reputation for extended attrition campaigns, the kind of practice built on the premise that most opponents run out of patience or money before they run out of legitimate claims. Gerald had chosen him carefully, which told me something about how Gerald assessed the situation. He was not treating this as a straightforward dissolution. He was treating it as a war that could be won by exhaustion. Let him file, I said. James was quiet for a moment in the way he got quiet when he was recalibrating his read of a client. Most people find discovery motions at least somewhat unsettling. I'm sure they do, I said. I've been unsettled for 7 months. I've had time to work through it. James filed our response that afternoon. Patricia began preparing the financial documentation Holloway had requested, and I sat down that evening and wrote 2 letters, one to Elise in Philadelphia, and one to Michael in Portland. Short, factual, asking them to call me when they had time and privacy. I did not put the reason in writing because some things need to be said in a voice, not read from a page. Elise called within the hour. She had always been quick that way, attuned to the register of things the way some people have an ear for music. She heard the word private and she stepped into her study and she closed the door and she said, "Mom, what's happening?" I told her. I gave her the shape of it, the affair, the duration, the financial concealment, the dinner, James Whitfield. I was measured and clear and I did not cry, which surprised me a little. Elise was quiet through all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment longer. Then she said, 3.5 years. Yes. He sat at Christmas dinner with us for 3.5 years and he was keeping an apartment for another woman. Yes. Mom. Her voice broke on the word and then recovered, the way her voice had always done, breaking and recovering, since she was a child who had learned early that her feelings were valid and that they also needed to be manageable. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Don't be sorry for me, I said. I'm all right. I'm more than all right. I want you to hear that clearly. I've been preparing for this for months. I have a very good attorney and a very good forensic accountant and I have a case that is going to be heard properly. Do you need me to come? Not yet. I'll tell you when I need you. She was quiet again. Then, the Columbia law thing. I hadn't told her about Columbia directly. I had mentioned it years ago, the way you mention things to your children when they're old enough to ask about your life before them. What you want it to be. What you gave up. I had framed it as a choice I made freely, because that was the more livable story, and because I had believed it for so long it had the texture of truth. Yes, I said. You always said it was a choice. It was a choice, I said. It was also a consequence. Both things are true. Elise was a social worker in Philadelphia, who spent her days helping people find language for complicated things. I could hear her now, searching for language. I always knew, she said finally, that you were the smartest person in that marriage. That was when I nearly cried. Not from grief but from being seen, which is its own particular thing, different from grief entirely. Thank you, I said. He doesn't know what he's done, she said. Dad thinks he's up against a housewife. He doesn't understand who you actually are. No, I agreed. He doesn't. Michael called the following morning. His reaction was different from his sister's, as it had always been. Michael processed things slowly in layers, and what came first was not grief or solidarity but a kind of bewildered disorientation, as if the coordinates of his entire history had shifted and he needed a moment to find his footing on the new ground. How long have you known? He asked. 7 months certain. Longer suspected. And you didn't tell us. I needed to build the legal case first, I said. I needed to be sure of the ground before I asked either of you to stand on it. A pause. I could hear the sounds of the restaurant kitchen behind him, the clatter and heat of the lunch prep he had probably stepped away from to take my call. He always seemed so. Michael started and then stopped. He tried again. I never thought he'd do something like this. I know. Are you okay? Like actually okay, not just saying you're okay? I smiled at the phone. Of the two of them, Michael had always been the one who asked the follow-up question. I'm actually okay, I said. I promise you. I'm in a better position than you'd think. What does that mean? It means I've been more prepared than anyone in this situation knew, including your father. Another pause. Then quietly, he's going to hate losing. Yes, I said. He is. Good, Michael said, and the single word held 40 years of a son watching his father take credit for things he had not done alone. Gerald called me directly on a Sunday evening, 2 weeks into the formal proceedings. It was not something his attorney would have recommended, which told me something about how the discovery process was going. Martin Holloway was a skilled strategist, but he couldn't control a client who had spent 40 years being the most powerful person in every room he entered. I answered because I was curious about what he would say. Catherine, he began, and his voice had the careful warmth of a man who has decided that the personal approach will accomplish what the legal one hasn't. I'd like to talk. Not through attorneys. Just us. We have attorneys for a reason, Gerald. I know that. I'm asking you to set that aside for an hour. I think there are things that could be resolved between us that don't need to be resolved in a conference room. I watched the evening light come through the kitchen window, steady and amber, the kind that arrives in late August without urgency. What would you like to resolve? I asked. I made mistakes, he said. Significant ones. I'm not asking you to forgive them. I'm asking you to consider whether there's a way to handle this that doesn't require destroying everything we built over 4 decades. Everything we built, I said. Yes. Gerald, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. I kept my voice even. When you moved my grandmother's property sale into the initial capital for Preston Capital, whose firm did you intend to build? Silence. When you restructured the Harrington advisory account so that the fees flowed to the Delaware LLC instead of the marital estate, whose assets were you protecting? More silence. When you opened the Cayman account, I continued, and you made transfers small enough to avoid reporting thresholds for 7 consecutive years, whose future were you securing? He didn't answer. There was nothing to say to any of it that was not, in its way, a confession. We can continue to talk through our attorneys, I said. That's what they're for. I ended the call. He didn't try again. The following week, Patricia Ng came to James's office with a spreadsheet that changed the shape of the entire case. She set her laptop on the conference table and turned it so that James and I could both read the screen. What I saw was a chart of Preston Capital's client roster over the preceding 18 months, mapped against billing records and active account values. 11 of his top 14 clients, Patricia said, have transferred the majority of their active accounts to a new entity registered in Connecticut in March of this year. She pulled up a second document. The entity is called Preston Strategic Partners. Gerald is listed as a managing consultant. James and I looked at each other. He began moving the book before the divorce was filed, James said. 5 months before, Patricia confirmed. The timing corresponds with the initiation of the Harrington advisory restructuring. He was simultaneously relocating his personal assets offshore and migrating his firm's primary revenue sources to a parallel entity. I sat with that for a moment. Gerald had not only been hiding money, he had been deliberately reducing the apparent value of Preston Capital Management in advance of a proceeding in which I would claim an ownership interest in it. He had been engineering the outcome, building his escape route while I was still sitting across from him at dinner, smiling at the right moments, asking the right questions. What's the differential? I asked. Between the firm's value with the full client roster and its value as it currently stands? Patricia pulled up another screen. Conservative estimate, The relocated accounts represent approximately 62% of the firm's active revenue base. The difference in valuation is roughly $14 million. $14 million. Moved systematically over 5 months out of an entity in which I had a founding claim. James sat back in his chair. This changes our approach significantly. How? I asked. We were building a case around your historical contribution and the marital asset picture. This gives us something additional. He looked at Patricia, then at me. What Gerald has done with Preston Strategic Partners may constitute fraudulent conveyance in anticipation of divorce proceedings. That's not a civil asset division matter. That's potentially a separate cause of action. I looked at the chart on Patricia's laptop. 11 clients. $14 million. Moved in the months after Gerald had decided he was leaving, while I was living in the house, maintaining the calendar, attending the charity functions, smiling at the right moments. He thought he had time, I said. He thought he had much more time than he did, James agreed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The fraudulent conveyance claim changed the dynamics of the mediation that had been scheduled for October. Martin Holloway arrived at that session with the carefully composed manner of an attorney who has reviewed an unfavorable development and prepared for it, which is different from the manner of an attorney who is surprised. Holloway was not surprised. He was prepared. That told me Gerald had known the Preston strategic transfer would be found and had already built his defense. My client's position, Martin began, is that the establishment of Preston Strategic Partners represents a legitimate business restructuring that predates the marital dissolution proceedings and has no bearing on the asset division. James set 3 documents on the table without hurrying. The date of the first client account transfer to Preston Strategic is March 14th of this year. The date of Gerald's first consultation with the private wealth attorney who subsequently helped him establish the Harrington Delaware LLC is February 28th. The date of your client's first recorded communication with Diane Hartley discussing the possibility of cohabitation is January 9th. He looked up from the documents. The firm restructuring did not predate the decision to dissolve the marriage. It followed it by approximately 60 days. Martin looked at the documents. He had good courtroom composure, but I watched something settle in the line of his jaw that indicated he had hoped James wouldn't have the January correspondence. We have the communication records, James said simply. Mediation recessed for 20 minutes. When Martin and Gerald returned, the negotiating position had shifted in ways that were incremental but real. Gerald's attorneys had come in expecting to negotiate from strength. The strength had contracted. I watched Gerald across the table during the second session. He was 69 years old and he still had the bearing of someone accustomed to the premium end of every room, but something in it had gone slightly mechanical, the way a performance goes when the performer knows the audience can see the effort. He didn't look at me directly. He looked at James, at his own attorney, at the documents on the table, at his hands. Once briefly he looked at me. I held his gaze and he looked away first. That evening I drove to my storage unit on the west side of the city, the small one I had rented years ago for the boxes of household papers that accumulate in a long marriage. Tax returns, old correspondence, documents from the children's school years, things I had never been able to throw away and had never quite found a reason to retrieve. I had gone there looking for the early Preston Capital Incorporation documents, copies of which Patricia needed for the fraudulent conveyance filing. I found those in the second box I opened, in a manila folder labeled 1984 to 1986, Gerald's precise handwriting on the tab. In the same box, beneath the corporate documents, I found something I had not been looking for. A large envelope, cream-colored, with the Columbia Law School seal in the upper left corner. My name on the front in the formal typescript of 1977. My parents' address in Millhaven, which was where I had been living that spring. I sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit, in the fluorescent light, with the box open in front of me, and I held the envelope for a long time. I had not thought of myself as someone who kept things. Gerald's influence, probably. He was a man who believed in clean surfaces, in the management of accumulation. But my mother had saved this, and when she died and I cleared her house, I had brought it home without quite knowing why. And somewhere along the years of moving it from drawer to box to storage, I had lost track of where it was. I opened it. The letter was exactly as I remembered it, formal and brief in the way of institutional letters, offering admission to the Columbia University School of Law, class of 1980, and requesting confirmation of enrollment by June 15, 1977. I had been 22. The letter was now 46 years old. The woman who had received this letter had wanted to spend her life making things visible that other people had made invisible. Contracts that disadvantaged the uninformed, structures that protected the powerful at the expense of those who couldn't read them, the legal machinery that ran quietly beneath the surface of ordinary lives and shaped everything without most people ever noticing it. I had spent 45 years doing that work anyway. Not in a courtroom. In a marriage. I had read the fine print. I had caught the errors. I had understood the structures and said nothing because saying nothing was the role I had been given, and because I had told myself the more livable story for so long. No more. I put the letter in my bag. I took the corporate documents for Patricia. I closed the box, turned off the light, and locked the unit. When I got home, I called James. "I'd like to add something to my personal statement," I said. "For the record." "What would you like to add?" "I'd like the record to reflect that I was accepted to Columbia Law School in 1977 and deferred my enrollment upon marriage. I want that documented as part of the context for the ownership claim." "I can add that," James said. "Do you have documentation of the acceptance?" "I have the original letter." "A beat. Good. Bring it to our next meeting." Diane Hartley sent me a letter in October. It arrived at the townhouse by certified mail, which meant she had obtained my new address, which meant Gerald had given it to her or she had found it through other means. James's assistant called to tell me about it before the mail carrier delivered it, because James had arranged for certain categories of correspondence to be flagged. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on plain white paper, and it was not what I expected. She was not apologetic exactly. She was honest in a way that I found, despite everything, more bearable than an apology would have been. She wrote that she had known Gerald was married from the beginning, that she had told herself a story about it the way people tell themselves stories, and that the story had become less and less livable as the years passed. She wrote that she had not known about the full financial picture until the proceedings began and that what she had learned about Gerald's conduct, both toward me and toward the business, had told her something about who he was that she had chosen not to see clearly. She did not ask for anything. She did not offer anything. She wrote near the end, "I know this doesn't change what happened. I wanted you to know that I understand at least in part what was taken from you. And I wanted to say it directly rather than let it go unsaid." I read the letter twice. Then I set it aside and called James to tell him it had arrived. "Do you want it entered into the record?" he asked. I thought about it. "Not yet," I said. "Let me sit with it." I did not respond to Diane Hartley's letter. I did not respond to it for weeks and then months, and by the time I was ready to consider whether a response was warranted, the proceedings had moved into a phase where the dynamics between Gerald and me had shifted so completely that the question of what Diane Hartley and I owed each other had become smaller than it once seemed. But I kept the letter. It was, in its way, more honest than most of what I had received over the previous 45 years. Gerald's deposition was scheduled for the 3rd week of November, and James spent the preceding 10 days preparing me for what it would contain and what it would not. Gerald's attorneys would present a version of our financial history, in which my contributions were incidental and his were primary. They would argue that the Preston Capital founding capital had been a joint gift, not an investment with equity implications. They would characterize my management of the household and social calendar as the ordinary work of a spouse, compensated adequately by the comfortable lifestyle I had enjoyed. "Comfortable lifestyle," I said when James used that phrase. "That's the framing his attorneys will use," James said, with the neutrality of someone presenting a position he does not hold. "In 1985, I sold my grandmother's property for $180,000 and gave it to Gerald for his firm," I said. "In 1977, I declined Columbia Law School. In the years between those dates and the present, I managed his social relationships, corrected his associates' errors, raised 2 children largely alone while he traveled, and maintained the infrastructure of a life that supported a 40-year career in wealth management." I looked at James steadily. "A comfortable lifestyle." "Yes," James said. "That is what they will argue. Then make sure our record is complete. It was complete. Patricia had spent 3 months making it complete. The deposition transcript, when it arrived, was thorough in the way that all deposition transcripts are thorough, every question and answer recorded with the flat fidelity of a machine that does not editorialize. Gerald answered carefully and sometimes evasively and occasionally with the kind of careful precision that indicates a rehearsed response, and James noted each of those moments and filed them away for the examination that would follow. There was one exchange near the end of the deposition that James flagged for my particular attention. He had asked Gerald directly, "Were you aware, at the time of the initial capital contribution in 1985, that the funds being contributed came from the sale of your wife's inherited property?" Gerald had paused for 4 seconds, which the transcript recorded as simply a pause, but which I knew, in the way that 45 years of watching a person teaches you to know things, was the pause of a man deciding between 2 answers, the true one and the useful one. "I was aware that Catherine had property that she sold," he said. "The proceeds went into our shared finances." "Our shared finances," James had repeated. "And at that time, did you discuss with Catherine whether her contribution would be reflected in the ownership structure of the new firm?" Another pause. 3 seconds this time. "We discussed the investment generally," Gerald said. "Can you describe that discussion?" "It was a long time ago," Gerald said. "I don't recall the specifics." 45 years of marriage, and his clearest memory of the day his wife funded his firm was that the discussion had been general and the specifics were unavailable. I read that exchange 3 times. Not from anger, though there was some of that. Mostly I read it because I needed to understand the distance between the man who had said, across a restaurant table on a winter night in 1978, that he wanted to build a life with me, and the man in the deposition transcript who could not recall the specifics of the day I gave him my grandmother's inheritance. The distance was the whole story. It was 45 years long and it was the exact shape of what had been taken. Elise came up from Philadelphia in December, and we spent 3 days together in the townhouse I had moved to after leaving the West Village apartment Gerald and I had shared. It was smaller and quieter, and the light came through the windows differently, and I had filled it with my books and my grandmother's quilt and a few things from the old house that had always been mine in every sense except the legal one. On the second evening, we sat in the kitchen with tea and she asked me something she had been circling for weeks. "Do you regret marrying him?" I considered the question honestly, the way she had earned. "I regret the version of the marriage where I stopped asking questions," I said. "I don't regret Elise and Michael. I don't entirely regret the life, because it was my life and I was not nothing in it, even when I let myself be treated as if I were." I wrapped both hands around my cup. "I regret the Columbia letter. But I think I would have regretted leaving Gerald in 1977 too, in different ways. The regret was always going to be somewhere. I just didn't choose where it landed." Elise was quiet. Then, "You should have been a lawyer." "I know. You still could be." I looked at my daughter, this sharp-eyed, compassionate woman who had my mother's quality of attention, and something that was entirely her own. 67 years old. The proceedings would conclude in the spring. Patricia's best estimate of the settlement, given the fraudulent conveyance claim and the ownership interest and the marital asset picture, was a number that I was still getting accustomed to the shape of. "Maybe," I said. Elise smiled. "I'm serious." "I know you are." What I did not tell her not yet was what James had told me that week in a phone call I was still processing. Patricia had completed a second pass of the Preston Capital financial records and found something that had not been visible in the first pass, something that required a different kind of attention to see, a historical strand running through the firm's earliest years that changed the accounting in ways that were not straightforward and which I needed time to absorb before I discussed it with anyone. It was not about the Delaware LLC or the Cayman account. It was about something older, something that had been in the corporate structure since before the firm had its first outside client, something Gerald had arranged in 1985 in the weeks after the initial capital contribution, and which had been quietly in place ever since. "It changes your position significantly," James had said. "More than we discussed in October." "How much more?" "Catherine." He paused in the way he paused when he was choosing precision over efficiency. "I'd rather walk through this in person." We were scheduled to meet the following Monday. I had spent the intervening days not precisely calm, but oriented, the way you orient when you know that something is coming and you have learned, over a long season of preparation, that the practice of waiting with your eyes open is different from the practice of being afraid. The proceedings were entering their final phase. Martin Holloway's strategy of extended attrition had run up against something it wasn't designed for. A woman who did not get tired. Gerald had moved his money and his business and his future, and he had done it believing he was dealing with a housewife, with someone whose 45 years of competence had been so invisible for so long that it might as well not exist. He was about to learn otherwise. Monday morning, James's office, the folder on the conference table, and whatever was inside it. I drove there in the early December light, through streets already bright with the approaching holiday, and I thought about my grandmother's house in Millhaven, the smell of it, the particular quality of light through old windows, the way she had kept her things with the careful attention of someone who understood that what you hold matters and what you give away matters more. She had given me the property. I had given it to Gerald. Gerald had built a firm on it and a career and a life and eventually a secret other life, and had spent decades making sure my name was nowhere on the record. Whatever was in that folder, I was ready to know. Whatever the full accounting said, I was ready to hear it. I parked. I walked through the lobby. I took the elevator to James Whitfield's floor and I sat in the waiting room with my hands folded and my back straight and my mind clear, the way I had sat at Chez Laurent 2 months earlier, ready for the thing that was coming, which was the truth, which had been coming for a very long time and which was no longer in a position to go anywhere except forward. James Whitfield had a particular way of opening a folder. Unhurried, precise, with the kind of deliberateness that signals the contents are worth the moment of stillness before you encounter them. I had sat across from him enough times by now to read the gesture accurately. This one was slower than usual. He turned the folder to face me. On top was a document I recognized as a corporate filing, older paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, the kind of thing that has spent decades in a drawer somewhere. Below it was a chain of subsequent filings, each referencing the one before. This is the original certificate of incorporation for Preston Capital Management, James said. Filed with the state of New York on April 3, 1985. I looked at it. It was 2 pages, dense with the formal language of corporate registration from that era. I scanned it until I found what James wanted me to find. Listed as founding members of the corporation, in the section titled Initial Members and Capital Contributions, Gerald Allen Preston, contributing $120,000, representing 60% of initial equity. And below his name listed second, Catherine Marie Preston, née Hale, contributing $180,000, representing 40% of initial equity. My name. On the founding document of the firm. 40%. I read it twice. Then I looked up at James. He listed me, I said. In 1985, yes. For tax reasons most likely, and because at the time there may have been some advantage in structuring the contribution as equity rather than a loan. Patricia believes Gerald's original attorney recommended it. James pulled out the next document in the chain. Then in 1988, Preston Capital underwent its first structural reorganization. A new operating agreement was executed. In that agreement, the membership interests were restructured, and Catherine Preston's 40% was converted to what the document calls a silent beneficiary interest, with no voting rights and no listed equity percentage. Silent beneficiary, I said. A category his attorney invented, essentially. It has no standard legal meaning. It appears in no other document Patricia found in the firm's history. It was inserted specifically to remove your name from the active equity table, while technically not eliminating your interest entirely. Technically, I said. In 1992 there was a second reorganization. The silent beneficiary interest was not mentioned at all. By that filing you had simply ceased to appear. I sat with the original 1985 document in my hands. 40%. Listed in the Founders section, in typescript from a machine that had probably sat in some midtown law office and is now 40 years gone. Gerald signed this, I said. Gerald signed this, James confirmed, as did the attorney who drafted it, and a notary. The signature is authenticated. And in 1988, when the first reorganization happened. You also signed that document, James said, and he said it gently, which told me the thing he was about to say required gentleness. He turned to the 1988 reorganization filing. My signature was at the bottom of page 6, In handwriting I recognized as mine from 35 years ago. Below Gerald's, below the attorney's, in a space labeled Member Acknowledgement. I stared at my own signature. I signed it, I said. You signed a 17-page reorganization agreement in 1988. Patricia found it in the firm's archived records. The document creates the silent beneficiary category and converts your equity. It's possible you were told it was routine, a standard restructuring for growth. It's possible you weren't told much at all. I thought back to 1988. Michael had been 4 years old. Elise had been 7. I had been managing 2 children and a household and a social calendar that had expanded as Gerald's career expanded, and Gerald had periodically set papers in front of me at the kitchen table with a pen and a brief explanation, and I had signed them because I trusted him, because he was my husband, because he handled the business and I handled the life, and that was the arrangement, and I had never had an attorney review anything Gerald put in front of me in the 30 years before I called. James Whitfield. Is the 1988 agreement enforceable? I asked. That's where it becomes interesting, James said. He pulled the next document. The reorganization required your informed consent to convert a vested equity interest. Patricia has found no evidence that you received independent legal counsel before signing. Gerald's attorney represented the firm's interest, not yours. Under New York law, the conversion of a founding equity interest without independent counsel and full disclosure is challengeable. Challengeable, I said. We believe the 1988 agreement is voidable. If the court agrees, your 40% founding equity interest reverts to its original form. The room was very quiet. December light came through the conference room windows, flat and clear. What is 40% of Preston Capital Management worth? I asked. Patricia Ng, who had been sitting at the end of the table with her laptop open, looked up. At current valuation, including the transferred client accounts under the fraudulent conveyance claim, and accounting for the full revenue history of the firm from 1985 to present. She paused. 40% of that is approximately $22 million. $22 million. Not a settlement figure. Not a negotiated amount. An equity interest that had been mine since 1985 and had been quietly erased from the record in a 17-page reorganization agreement that I had signed at my kitchen table while my 4-year-old son played on the floor beside me. I set the 1985 Incorporation document down on the table. I did not say anything for a moment. I was thinking about the kitchen table in the apartment on West 11th Street, the one we'd bought when we moved in, solid oak, Gerald's choice, and the particular quality of afternoon light in that kitchen in 1988, and what I must have been doing in the minutes before he set the papers in front of me, and whether I had read them and whether I would have understood what I was reading if I had. He knew, I said. In 1988, he knew what he was doing. He would have had to, James said. I looked at my own signature on the bottom of page 6 of the 1988 reorganization. 35 years ago. Catherine Preston, in the handwriting of a woman who trusted the man she had married, and had not yet learned the cost of that trust. Let's proceed, I said. James filed the challenge to the 1988 reorganization agreement the following week. Martin Holloway's response arrived in 4 days, which was fast, which meant Gerald had been expecting it, which meant he had known this document was in the firm's records and had calculated the odds of Patricia Ng finding it. He had miscalculated again. The challenge triggered a preliminary hearing in February before Judge Eleanor Marsh, who was 61 years old and had spent 20 years on the matrimonial bench and whose reputation, James told me, was for exactness and a particular impatience with documentation that had been arranged to obscure rather than clarify. We sat at the plaintiff's table. Gerald and Martin Holloway sat at the defense table. Gerald was dressed well, as he always was, and he held himself with the practiced composure of a man who has spent a career presenting himself in conference rooms and boardrooms and public-facing situations that required a specific kind of authority. But I had spent 45 years reading Gerald Preston, and I could see what the effort cost him now in a way that had not been visible before. The composure was work. It had always been work. I had simply not been in a position to see the labor until I stopped doing labor on his behalf. Judge Marsh reviewed the 1985 Incorporation document and the 1988 reorganization with the unhurried attention of someone who reads financial documents the way other people read novels, looking for the narrative beneath the language. She asked Martin Holloway 3 questions. His answers to all three were technically responsive and substantively evasive, which was a combination that Judge Marsh had evidently encountered before and did not find interesting. Then she looked at the signature page of the 1988 reorganization. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "was Mrs. Preston represented by independent counsel at the time she signed this document?" Martin said she had not required independent counsel, as the reorganization was an internal firm matter. Judge Marsh looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not hostile and not warm and conveyed very precisely that she had heard this argument in some form many times and that its age had not improved it. She ruled on the challenge 6 weeks later in March. The 1988 reorganization agreement was voidable due to the absence of independent counsel and the failure to provide full disclosure of the equity conversion's effect on Catherine Preston's founding interest. The 40% founding interest reverted. Gerald's attorneys filed an immediate appeal. The appeal was denied in April. The settlement negotiations that followed were the most concentrated 3 weeks of the entire proceedings. Martin Holloway brought a mediator, a former judge named Clarence Webb who was known for finding compromises in cases where the positions had calcified, and the four of us sat in a conference room on the 31st floor of a midtown building every Tuesday and Thursday for 3 weeks in May, working through a financial picture that had expanded well beyond what either side had anticipated when the anniversary dinner took place 9 months earlier. Gerald did not look at me during most of those sessions. He looked at Martin, at Clarence Webb, at the documents, at the windows. Once, on the second Tuesday, he looked at me for a long moment in a way that I could not entirely read and which I did not attempt to interpret, because I had spent enough of my life interpreting Gerald Preston's expressions and I had no interest in doing it anymore on his behalf. Martin presented their opening position on the first Tuesday. James presented ours on the first Thursday. The distance between those positions was significant. Over the following weeks it closed, not equally from both sides, but in the direction that the evidence pointed, which is the direction evidence tends to point when someone has assembled it carefully and completely. Gerald capitulated finally on a Thursday afternoon in the third week, and the capitulation was quiet. Not a moment of drama. Not a raised voice or a shattered composure. He simply said to Martin in a voice low enough that I almost didn't hear it across the table, "Accept the framework," and Martin nodded and said they would need to review the specific language, and Clarence Webb said that was entirely reasonable, and the session ended 40 minutes later with the broad terms agreed. The settlement was finalized in writing the following week. The 40% equity interest in Preston Capital, valued at $22 million, settled at $18 million after accounting for the appeal costs, and the negotiated discount for immediate resolution, rather than continued litigation. The marital asset division, which covered the West Village apartment, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, and the household assets accumulated over 45 years, added another $4.3 million. The fraudulent conveyance claim related to Preston Strategic Partners resulted in a clawback of $2.8 million. Representing the increase in Gerald's personal net worth attributable to the client transfers. $25,100,000 total. James set the final settlement document in front of me and I read every page, which took 40 minutes, which he had anticipated by bringing a thermos of coffee. When I reached the signature page, I signed it with the fountain pen my mother had given me when I graduated from Ohio State, which I had kept for 45 years and which I had not had occasion to use for anything this consequential until now. Gerald's signature was already on the page. His handwriting looked the same as it always had. Neat, controlled, the penmanship of someone who had been taught that presentation was character. I signed below it and did not feel in that moment what I had expected to feel. Not triumph. Not closure, which is a word people use for something that doesn't actually arrive in a clean form. What I felt was simpler and quieter than either of those things. I felt the particular steadiness of someone who has seen a long process through to its end, and is ready now for what comes after. Gerald's professional reckoning came not from anything I did, but from the accumulated arithmetic of his own choices, which is how these things tend to work when the record is complete. The fraudulent conveyance proceedings were a matter of public record, as civil litigation is, and Preston Capital's client base was a network of people who read financial news and understood, better than most, what the transfer of 11 accounts to a parallel entity in advance of divorce proceedings indicated about the principal's relationship with fiduciary responsibility. 3 of those 11 clients had already left Preston Strategic by the time the settlement was signed. 4 more left within the following 6 months. Martin Holloway released a statement on Gerald's behalf, carefully worded, acknowledging the settlement without admitting wrongdoing, describing the outcome as a mutual resolution of disputed matters. It was the kind of statement that people who know how to read statements recognize immediately as the language of someone who was not in a position to say anything else. Gerald sold the West Village apartment in July and moved to a smaller property in Connecticut. Diane Hartley had ended their relationship in January, during the period when the fraudulent conveyance claim was being established and the shape of who Gerald actually was had become visible in ways that, according to a brief note she sent me in the spring, she had found she could not arrange herself around. I read that second note the way I had read her first one, with the particular attention you give to something that arrives from an unexpected direction and tells you something true. She had not been, in the end, the story I had assumed she was. She had been her own story, and it had turned out to be a different one than she had thought she was living too. I did not write back, but I kept both her notes. They were honest, and honest things are worth keeping. Michael drove down from Portland in June to help me move into the apartment I had found in Brooklyn Heights. It was the 3rd floor of a renovated brownstone with tall windows and built-in bookshelves and a small roof deck where you could see the bridge if you stood at the right corner in clear weather. It was mine outright, purchased without asking anyone's permission or waiting for anyone's approval, and the act of signing the purchase documents in April had felt like something I had been waiting to do for a very long time without knowing I was waiting. Michael carried boxes while I directed him, which he did cheerfully and with the occasional comment about the weight of books that was not a complaint but an observation. "You have a lot of books," he said on the 3rd trip up the stairs. "I've been accumulating them for 40 years, I said. "Most of them were in storage." "Why were they in storage?" Gerald didn't like clutter. Michael set the box down on the kitchen floor and looked at me for a moment with the expression he had developed over the past year, the one that said he was revising his understanding of his own childhood, and finding the revision uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. "Mom," he said. "I know," I said. "No, I mean." He sat down on the box. He was 40 years old and still made the same face he had made at 12 when he was working through something and the words weren't arriving fast enough. "I remember Dad's study. The bookshelves in there. All those business books and the biographies and everything. I always thought that was just who he was. Like, the intellectual of the family." "He had good taste in books," I said carefully. "But you have more." "I always had more. They were in boxes." Michael was quiet for a moment. Outside the window a truck went by. The apartment smelled of fresh paint, and the particular neutrality of newly cleaned rooms waiting for someone to make them specific. "I want to say something," Michael said, "and I don't want you to argue with me about it." "All right. You gave up a lot for us. For him. And I don't think we said thank you enough." "I know I didn't." "You were a child," I said. "Children don't thank their parents for structural decisions. That's not what childhood is for." "I'm not a child now." "No. So." He looked at the box of books, then at me. "Thank you. For all of it. Even the parts you shouldn't have had to do alone." I sat down on the windowsill and looked at my son, this tall, careful man who had grown up in a house where his father was often absent and his mother had made the absence seamless, had filled the space around it so that the children would not feel the shape of what was missing. "You're going to make me cry in this empty apartment," I said. "Before I've even unpacked the kettle." He laughed. "The kettle is in box 7. I labeled it." "You labeled the boxes." "I labeled all the boxes. I'm a restaurant owner. I have systems." We had tea on the roof deck that evening, with the bridge visible at the right corner, just as I had known it would be. Michael told me about a new dish he was developing, something with stone fruit and aged vinegar that he couldn't quite get right, and I listened the way I had always listened to Michael, with the full attention that he had always deserved and had sometimes in the busy years not quite gotten, and it was a good evening, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. Elise came up a month later, in July, and we spent a Saturday afternoon in the apartment with the windows open and the sounds of the neighborhood coming through, and at some point in the late afternoon she picked up the Columbia letter from where it sat on my desk, the original in its cream envelope. "You kept it," she said. "I found it in storage." She held it for a moment without opening it. She knew what it said. She had known since December when I told her. She was looking at the physical object, the envelope and the seal and the address in Millhaven, Ohio, a letter sent to a 22-year-old woman who had wanted to spend her life making invisible things visible. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. I had thought about this for months. I had thought about it seriously, which meant I had not allowed myself the comfort of a quick answer, because the quick answer was not the true one. "I called Columbia," I said. Elise looked up from the envelope. "Not about law school," I said. "About something else. They have a program. Executive Legal Education. It's not a JD, it's a certificate program, aimed at people with professional backgrounds who want formal legal training without starting from the beginning. 1 year. Intensive. They accept a small cohort." "Mom." I submitted an application in May. Elise set the envelope down on the desk. Her eyes were bright in a way she was managing with the same composure I recognized from her childhood, that break and recover quality. "Have you heard back?" she asked. "Last week," I said. "I've been waiting to tell you in person." She already knew from my face. "Tell me." "I start in September." Elise crossed the room and put her arms around me and I let her, and we stood like that for a moment in the July light with the windows open and the sounds of the street below, and it was not a triumphant moment exactly. Triumph suggests something conclusive, something final, and this did not feel final. It felt like a beginning, which is a different and in some ways more demanding thing. "Mom," she said into my shoulder. "I know," I said. "Are you scared?" I thought about it honestly, which is what she deserved. "A little," I said. "Not of the work. Of what it means to finally do the thing that got deferred for 45 years. She pulled back and looked at me. "What does it mean?" "It means I have to stop telling myself the story where I chose this life freely and it was enough," I said. "And start telling the story where I chose it and it cost me something real and I am choosing now to recover the thing it cost, or the version of it that's still available at 67. I looked at the letter on the desk. "It means being honest about all of it, which is harder than anything I've done in the legal proceedings because the legal proceedings were about external facts and this is about the internal ones." Elise took my hand. Neither of us said anything for a while. The afternoon went on outside the windows. Then she said, "She would have been proud of you, Grandma." "Yes," I said. "I think she would." The first day of the Columbia program was a Monday in September, warm still, the city not yet into the color change that would come in October. I walked into the building on 116th Street at 8:45 in the morning with a canvas bag of notebooks and the same focused, slightly disoriented feeling I imagine I would have had in 1977, if I had come then. The cohort was 17 people. A surgeon. A former diplomat. 2 engineers. A woman who had been a federal regulator for 30 years and wanted to understand, she said, the legal structure of what she had been administering. A retired judge who had decided she wanted a practitioner's education. People who had spent careers in one world and had arrived at the conclusion that they needed the tools of another. People who had deferred something and were now, at whatever age and at whatever cost, going back for it. The first class was contracts. The professor was young, probably 35, and she wrote the fundamental principle of contract law on the board in clean letters. Offer, acceptance, consideration. Then she turned to the cohort and asked, "What do we mean when we say a party entered into a contract knowingly?" I wrote it down. Knowingly. In 1988, I had signed a document at my kitchen table while my 4-year-old played on the floor beside me. I had not been represented by independent counsel. I had not been given full disclosure of the equity conversion's effect. I had signed it because my husband had put it in front of me and I had trusted him, and trust is not the same as knowledge, and knowledge is what the law requires. The law has a word for what happened in 1988. Several of them, in fact. Voidable. Lacking informed consent. Enforceable only against a party who entered knowingly. I had spent 45 years not knowing the words for what had been done to me. The words had existed the whole time. I simply hadn't had access to them. I wrote them down now. All of them. 6 months after the settlement was finalized, I stood in a room I had never expected to stand in. The conference room of the New York Legal Aid Society's Family Law Division, where I had been asked to speak to a group of staff attorneys about the financial dimensions of contested divorce cases in long-term marriages. James Whitfield had recommended me. He had been specific about why. Not because of my settlement, though the outcome of my case had made several things visible that were useful for the attorneys in that room to understand, but because of the process by which I had assembled the evidence. The methodical accumulation, the patience, the ability to hold knowledge without acting on it prematurely, the attention to documents that had been arranged to obscure rather than clarify. I stood at the head of the table and I told the story in the precise, fact-based way that I had learned, or perhaps remembered, in the year since the proceedings began. I talked about the original incorporation document, and what it revealed about the relationship between trust and legal record. I talked about the 1988 reorganization and what the absence of independent counsel had cost, and what it cost the many women who sign documents at kitchen tables while their children play on the floor, trusting that the person who loves them would not arrange their signature against their interest. I talked about the work of making invisible things visible. The labor of the household and the social calendar and the client relationships and the children's appointments and the quiet corrections of the associates' errors. The 40 years of running an invisible infrastructure that supported a visible career, and what it means when none of that labor appears in any record. The attorneys in that room were young, most of them, in their 30s. They listen with the attention of people whose work requires them to understand how situations actually develop beneath the stories that get told about them. When I finished, a woman at the far end of the table asked me a question. She was perhaps 32, with the direct, careful manner of someone who has spent several years learning to ask the right question rather than the comfortable one. "What would you have done differently?" she asked. "If you had known then what you know now?" I thought about it honestly. "I would have had an attorney review every document I signed," I said. Not because I didn't trust Gerald, but because trust and documentation are separate systems, and the law treats them that way for a reason. "What else?" she asked. I would have understood that my labor had a legal dimension, not just a personal one. That the invisible work of a marriage is not invisible to the law if you know how to name it. She wrote something down. I watched her write it. "And," I said, because she had asked honestly and deserved the full answer, "I would have gone to Columbia in 1977. But that one is harder to recommend as legal advice." There was a small warm sound in the room, not quite laughter, something more knowing than that. The sound of people who understand what is being said and why it is not funny and why it is also, in some register, funny. I drove home to Brooklyn Heights that evening through the October streets. The color change finally arrived. The trees in Prospect Park burning amber and red in the last of the afternoon light. I had a paper due the following week for my contracts class. I had a meeting with James on Thursday to discuss the final disbursement from the trust account that held the settlement funds. I had dinner with Elise on Sunday and with Michael in 2 weeks when he was next in the city. I had, in other words, a life. My own, built on my own terms, shaped by my own choices, without the daily accommodation and adjustment and compression of self that I had practiced for so long it had started to feel like breathing. My grandmother had left me a piece of property in 1979, and I had given it to Gerald, and Gerald had built a firm on it, and that firm had become a 45-year career, and somewhere in the middle of all of that the property and the career and the 40% had been restructured into something that did not have my name on it. And then, eventually, a forensic accountant named Patricia Ng had found the original document in an archived file, and a judge named Eleanor Marsh had read a 17-page reorganization agreement and understood what it had been designed to do, and the 40% had returned. I thought sometimes, in the evenings on the roof deck with the bridge visible at the right corner, about what my grandmother would have made of all of it. She had been a practical woman, the daughter of immigrants who understood that what you own and what you can prove you own are different things, and that the difference between them is the law. She had given me the property to give me a foundation. I had given the foundation away. And then I had spent a very long time building another one, out of different materials, out of patience and attention and the willingness to finally, at 67, ask the questions I should have asked at 22. The foundation was solid now. I had checked it carefully. I knew how to check things carefully. In November, I received a letter from the New York State Bar Association about a new initiative they were developing. A mentorship program pairing senior legal professionals with mid-career attorneys navigating complex matrimonial cases. They were looking for advisors with direct experience in long-term marriage financial disputes, people who understood the territory from the inside. James had recommended me again. He was developing a habit of that which I did not discourage. I wrote back the same day and said yes. The program's first cohort began in January. 12 attorneys, 12 advisors. My advisee was a woman named Rosa, 44 years old, 8 years into a matrimonial practice, sharp and thorough and sometimes impatient with the pace of proceedings in ways I recognized and was in a position to speak to. We met every other week in a coffee shop in the West Village, 3 blocks from the apartment building that Gerald had been living in with Diane Hartley when the divorce proceedings began. I had chosen the coffee shop without thinking about the proximity and only noticed it on the 3rd meeting, by which point it had ceased to matter. Rosa was working a case involving a marriage of 31 years in which the marital business had been restructured 4 times, each time in ways that incrementally reduced the non-working spouse's visible interest. The pattern was familiar to me in ways that were useful for her, and clarifying for both of us. "How do you stay steady?" she asked me one afternoon, when the case she was describing had clearly been wearing on her. "When the other side is deliberately obscuring everything, when you're finding things and they're burying them as fast as you find them, how do you not let it exhaust you?" I thought about James's conference room in December. The folder opened slowly, the 1985 Incorporation document with my name listed second. The kitchen table in 1988. The storage unit in October, the fluorescent light, the cream envelope. "You remember what you're actually doing," I said. "You're not fighting the obscurement. You're building the record. The record is what persists. The obscurement is temporary, because things that are arranged to hide other things eventually require more energy than the truth requires, and systems that run on that kind of energy eventually fail." Rosa looked at me. "That sounds like experience talking." "It is," I said. She went back to her case. I went back to my contracts paper and my Tuesday seminars and the roof deck in the early mornings when the city was still quiet and the bridge was very clear against the sky. I was 67 years old. I had a settlement that had changed everything material about my circumstances. I had an apartment that was mine, books that were no longer in storage, a kettle in a labeled box and a fountain pen that had signed the most important document of my adult life. I had 2 children who called me regularly, not to manage me or assess my financial condition, but because they wanted to talk to their mother. I had a year of formal legal education and a second cohort scheduled. And I had, finally, after 45 years of telling myself the story where I had freely chosen a life that was enough, the honest version. The honest version is this: I was 22 and I was in love and I trusted someone who did not fully deserve the trust one gave him, and I gave him 45 years and a great deal of what I might have been, and that cost was real and the cost was also mine, and no one else was responsible for the choices I made inside the one he made when he listed his girlfriend's address as a corporate entity named after our honeymoon hotel. I had been complicit in my own erasure, partly from love and partly from fear and partly from the particular way that women of my generation were taught to measure their worth by the happiness of the people around them. That complicity was mine to own and mine to stop. I had stopped. Whatever came next, I would meet it with my name on the document. Not as a silent beneficiary with no voting rights and no equity percentage, listed in a category that an attorney invented specifically to make me disappear. As a founding member. As Catherine Marie Preston, née Hale, contributing her interest, documented and acknowledged, enforceable in any court that reads its evidence carefully. My grandmother would have approved of that, I think. She always did prefer the original document. She went back to Millhaven in October. She had not been back since her mother's funeral 6 years earlier, and before that not for nearly a decade, the way that distance accumulates when the life you are living pulls consistently in the other direction. Gerald had never liked Millhaven. He found it slow, he said, meaning that nothing there reflected well on him, which was the criterion by which he measured most things. She had brought the children twice when they were small, and they had run through the yard and marveled at her father's library wall and eaten her mother's pie. And then they had gone back to New York and the house on Birchwood Lane had gradually become a place that existed in memory rather than in practice. She drove down from Columbus in a rental car on a Friday afternoon in the second week of October, 2 months after her first day at Columbia. For months after Michael had labeled the boxes in Brooklyn Heights. The house had been sold after her mother's death and was now owned by a young couple who had, according to her sister Ruth in her Christmas letters, repainted the shutters and planted a vegetable garden and installed a new kitchen. She did not stop at the house. She drove past it slowly, noting the new shutters, which were a sensible dark green, and the garden in its autumn state, gone to seed now but clearly well tended through the summer. She stopped instead at the cemetery on the east side of town, where her parents lay beside the grandparents who had preceded them, in the quiet, practical way of families who have been in the same place long enough to accumulate their dead in one location. She stood at her grandmother's grave for a long time. The stone was simple, just a name and 2 dates and a brief phrase her grandfather had chosen. She knew the value of things. Catherine had always read that as a compliment about her grandmother's frugality, her ability to stretch a budget, her refusal to waste. She read it differently now. Knowing the value of things is not the same as knowing their price. It means understanding what something is worth to you, what you would be without it, what it costs to give it away carelessly. Her grandmother had known that distinction. She had tried in her way to teach it. The property had been 14 acres of farmland on the county road outside town, valued in the 1979 sale at $180,000. 14 acres, her grandmother's whole working life accumulated in the land, given to Catherine as a foundation on which to build. Catherine had built. It had taken 46 years and several people and a forensic accountant and a judge named Eleanor Marsh, but she had built. She set a small bunch of dahlias from the market in Columbus against the stone, and stood there a moment longer in the October wind. I used it, she said aloud. Eventually. On the drive back to Columbus, she passed the library where she had spent most of her childhood Saturday afternoons, a brick building from 1923 with stone steps worn smooth by decades of feet. She had read everything in the children's section by age 10 and had convinced the librarian, a tall woman named Miss Creighton, to allow her access to the adult stacks 2 years before the standard age. Miss Creighton had given her a card printed on heavy paper with her name typed across it. Special reader Catherine Hale. The library was still there. She stopped. It was smaller than she remembered, as places from childhood are. The children's section had been renovated, bright colors and low shelves and a reading corner with cushions. The adult stacks were unchanged, the same geometry of narrow aisles and wooden shelving that she had navigated at 12 with a flashlight on winter evenings. A young woman at the reference desk looked up when Catherine came in. She was perhaps 25, with the attentive expression of someone who has chosen a profession that requires genuine interest in other people. "Can I help you?" "I grew up here," Catherine said. "I just wanted to see it." The young woman smiled. "We get that a lot. Former regulars coming back." "I used to read everything I could find about the law," Catherine said. "Contract cases mostly. I was 14. The young woman looked at her with the particular curiosity of someone encountering an unexpected thing and wanting to understand it. "Did you become a lawyer?" Catherine considered the question with the honesty she had been practicing. "I'm becoming one," she said. "A little later than planned." She sat in the library for an hour. She took a book off the adult shelves at random and read 20 pages of it without retaining much, just to sit in the specific quality of silence that the library produced, the same silence it had produced when she was 12 and 14 and 21, the silence of a place built specifically for the accumulation of knowledge and the spending of time on understanding. On the drive to the airport, she called Ruth. Her younger sister answered on the third ring, surprised and warm. They talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than they had talked in years, and somewhere in the middle of it Ruth said something that Catherine had not expected. "I always thought you were the bravest one in our family," Ruth said. "For going to New York. For marrying someone so different from everyone we knew. For just going." "Brave," Catherine said. "Aren't you?" She thought about the anniversary dinner. About the December morning she had signed on James Whitfield's dotted line with her mother's fountain pen. About sitting in a Columbia lecture hall at 67 with a notebook and a pen and 45 years of deferred attention. "I think brave and stubborn might look the same from the outside," she said. Ruth laughed. "Yes," she said. "That's probably true. And they're both good." She arrived at the Columbia orientation not knowing what she had expected exactly, but finding something different from it. The room held 17 people. She had known this from the program materials. What the materials had not conveyed was the particular quality of 17 people who have all arrived, at different ages and from different directions, at the same decision to go back for something they left behind or never had access to. She sat next to a man named Victor Osei, 61 years old, who had spent 30 years as a cardiovascular surgeon and had decided, after a malpractice case in which the legal outcome had seemed to him structurally disconnected from the medical truth, that he needed to understand the mechanism rather than simply be subject to it. He had the precise, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to operating in conditions where error has immediate consequences. "What brought you?" he asked, during the introductory session where they were invited to speak briefly about their backgrounds. She gave the honest version, which she had been practicing. "I was accepted here in 1977 and deferred for a marriage that lasted 45 years and ended last spring. I'm interested in matrimonial financial law, specifically the legal structures that render contributions invisible." Victor looked at her for a moment. 45 years is a long deferral. "Yes," she said. "Worth it." She thought about Michael at 4 years old on the kitchen floor. About Elise's voice saying, "I always knew you were the smartest person in that marriage." About the roof deck and the bridge in the early mornings. "The children were worth it," she said. The deferral was not a requirement of having the children. "Those are different things." Victor nodded slowly, in the way of someone receiving new information and filing it accurately. "I think," he said, "this cohort is going to be interesting." He was right. The 17 of them occupied a particular space in the room that the younger students in other Columbia programs did not, the space of people who have already lived considerable portions of their lives, and who bring that weight to every reading and every class discussion. They argued with the professors in ways that the professors seemed to find genuinely useful. They made connections between legal principle and human experience that the case materials alone did not provide. They were, in short, people who understood what was at stake because they had stood in it. The contracts professor, the young woman who had written offer, acceptance, consideration on the board on the first day, told Catherine after class in the 8th week that she was one of the most precise reasoners she had encountered in the program. "You read the cases like someone looking for the person inside them," she said. "There's always a person inside them," Catherine said. "The cases just take a while to get there." Patricia Ng called in November to say that Gerald's appeal of the fraudulent conveyance ruling had been denied for the second and apparently final time, and then she said something else. "I'd like to take you to lunch," she said. "Not about the case. About something I've been thinking about." They met at a restaurant in Midtown on a Wednesday, a quiet Italian place that Patricia clearly knew well, and where the waiter brought bread without being asked. Patricia was 44 years old and had the focused, slightly compressed energy of someone who has spent a career in the detailed work of financial forensics and has learned to be patient with everything that isn't numbers. "I've been doing matrimonial forensics for 11 years, Patricia said, once they had ordered. "I've worked with James on 32 cases. 14 of those involved long-term marriages with financial structures arranged to minimize the non-working spouse's visible claim." Catherine waited. "Of those 14 cases, yours had the most complete original documentation. The 1985 Incorporation, the 1988 chain, the Cayman sequence. Gerald kept everything. That was his weakness, actually. He was too meticulous to destroy things, and too confident to expect they'd ever be found." "You found them. You made it possible for me to find them," Patricia said. "The records you had in storage, the fax confirmation you photographed, the notes from the PI. Without your groundwork, the forensic work would have taken twice as long and found half as much." Catherine considered this. She had not thought of her preparation as forensic groundwork. She had thought of it as the same methodical attention she had brought to everything: Gerald's clients' birthdays, Michael's tutoring schedule, the gallery tickets with the handwritten notes. "What was it you wanted to discuss?" she asked. Patricia set down her bread. "I want to propose something. Not today necessarily. But I want you to hear it and think about it." She looked at Catherine directly. "I'm expanding my practice. I've been working only through attorneys on referral, but I want to add a client-facing consultancy, specifically for women in long-term marriages who are in the early stages of building a case and don't yet know what they're looking for or where to look." She paused. "I want to know if you'd be interested in being part of that." The offer sat in the air between them for a moment. "I'm still in the certificate program," Catherine said. "I know. I'm not asking for now. I'm asking for when you're ready." "What would the role be?" "You'd be the person who talks to clients before the legal work begins. The person who helps them understand what they observed and how to document it. You've been on the other side of that process. You know what it looks like from inside the marriage, not just from inside the conference room." Catherine thought about the first note she had made after reviewing the credit card statements. The florist in the East 60s. The wine merchant in Tribeca. How she had stared at those charges for 2 weeks, not yet knowing what she was looking at, knowing only that they were there. "Let me think about it," she said. "Take all the time you need," Patricia said, and poured them both more water, and changed the subject to something easier, and they had a long, pleasant lunch. Walking back to the subway afterward, Catherine thought that this was what friendship felt like when it arrived late, without the long shared history of earlier friendships, but with the particular clarity of two people who have seen each other in professional circumstances that require honesty and have found each other worth knowing outside of them. She had Patricia's card in her pocket. She already knew she would call. The gala was in December, the annual benefit for the Metropolitan Library Foundation, which she had attended every year for 2 decades with Gerald, sitting at the firm's table, wearing the dress he approved of, making the conversation that kept the client relationships warm. She went alone this year, which was new, and she sat at a table with 3 people from the Legal Aid Society's board and 2 Columbia faculty members, which was also new, and it was in every way better than the previous arrangement. Halfway through the dinner, she noticed Helen Marsh across the room. Helen was the wife of Gerald's former managing partner, Robert Marsh, who had retired from the firm 3 years ago. She was 65, silver-haired, sharp-featured in an angular way that photographs well. She had always been pleasant to Catherine at these events, pleasant in the surface way that the wives of powerful men learn to be with each other. Warmth managed to a precise depth and no further. Catherine watched Helen register her across the room and registered the moment of recalibration in Helen's expression, the brief internal calculation that people make when they encounter someone whose context has shifted. Who is this person now, and how should I position myself relative to them? Helen came over between the appetizer and the entree. "Catherine." She bent to kiss the air beside her cheek in the way of their world. "I heard about the settlement. I hope you're well." "Very well," Catherine said. Helen looked at her for a moment, and something in the look was more genuine than the kiss had been. "Robert always said you were the one who actually kept things running over at Preston Capital. The client relationships, the social side of it. He said Gerald was brilliant at the business but didn't have the human touch for the relationships." "That's kind of Robert to say." "He wasn't being kind," Helen said. "He was being accurate. He was quite annoyed actually when Gerald retired 2 of his biggest clients last year. Said the relationships had been built through you and fell apart when you weren't there to maintain them." Catherine absorbed this. It was, in its way, the most expensive compliment she had ever received, and also the most confirming. "How is Robert?" she asked. "Retired and restless," Helen said with a dry affection. "He says he misses the work. What he misses is being important." They talked for 10 minutes, which was 9 minutes longer than their conversations had previously run, and when Helen left she pressed Catherine's hand in a way that was nothing like the air kiss, and said she hoped they would see each other again. Walking to the coat check afterward, Catherine thought about the invisible labor of keeping client relationships warm. The birthday calls and the gallery tickets and the careful notes. How it had looked from the outside like social pleasantry, and how it had actually been for 40 years the connective tissue of Gerald's professional world. Robert Marsh had seen it. He had named it to his wife accurately. It had taken Gerald until the anniversary dinner to understand what he was losing, and even then not entirely. Elise's children were 9 and 11, a girl named Nora and a boy named Theo, and they came to Brooklyn Heights for a weekend in January with Elise and her husband David. Catherine had set up the second bedroom with a folding cot for the 2 of them, and she had bought the specific cereal Nora preferred and the particular brand of orange juice that Theo considered the only acceptable form of the product, which Elise had texted her in advance because Catherine had asked. She had not been this kind of grandmother before. The kind who asks in advance what cereal and remembers. She had been the kind of grandmother who arrived at the correct events and brought thoughtful gifts and was warm and competent and not quite present, because presence requires attention and her attention had been distributed across too many surfaces for too long. She was trying to be different now. On Saturday morning, she took them to the Brooklyn Museum, which Nora had requested and Theo had agreed to on the condition that they could also go to the bookshop on Atlantic Avenue, which Catherine had agreed to without hesitation. They walked through the Egyptian collection, which Nora found extraordinary and Theo found acceptable, and through the feminist art wing, where Nora stopped for a long time in front of a painting of a woman at a desk surrounded by papers. "Who is she?" Nora asked. The placard identified the subject as a lawyer, painted in 1924. She was not famous. She had been painted by a friend who wanted to record what it looked like when a woman worked at a desk with the same authority that men did, as though this were simply the natural shape of the world. "A lawyer," Catherine said. "Like you're going to be?" Nora looked up at her. "Something like that." Nora looked back at the painting. She was 9 years old and had her mother's quality of focused attention, the kind that doesn't perform interest but simply has it. "She looks comfortable," Nora said. "Like she belongs there." "Yes," Catherine said. "She does." They stood together for a moment, the two of them, looking at the woman at the desk who had been painted because someone thought it was worth recording that she belonged there. At the bookshop on Atlantic Avenue, Theo found 2 volumes on ancient engineering and a book about the mathematics of bridge construction, which Catherine bought without hesitation. Nora found a novel and a collection of true crime cases for young readers, which was apparently a genre, and which made Catherine smile. "She wants to be a detective," Elise told her quietly, while the children examined a display near the window. "She'd be a good one," Catherine said. "She gets it from you." Catherine looked at Elise, who was watching her children with the expression of a mother who has learned to take real satisfaction in specific moments rather than waiting for the general happiness. "Do you think so?" Catherine asked. "I think she has your way of watching things," Elise said. "Like she's always taking notes." In February, she made her first major decision about the settlement funds. She had been careful in those first months not to move quickly. Sarah Chun, the financial advisor James had recommended after the settlement was finalized, had said the same thing that James had said after the divorce filing and that Patricia had said after the audit. Be patient with major decisions. Let the dust settle before you restructure. The funds were generating income. There was time. But this decision had been forming since October, since the cemetery in Millhaven, since the stone that said she knew the value of things. She established a fund. Not a full foundation, not yet. A fund administered through the New York Legal Aid Society's Family Law Division, dedicated to providing forensic financial services to non-working spouses in long-term marriage dissolution cases who could not otherwise afford them. The initial contribution was $800,000. Enough to fund Patricia Ng's consultation fee for approximately 30 cases over 2 years, with a review at the end of that period to assess expansion. She named it the Evelyn Hale Fund after her grandmother. Patricia, when Catherine told her over the phone, was quiet for a moment. "She'd be pleased," Patricia said. "She would," Catherine agreed. She understood what things were worth. When she told James, he was also quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll refer cases to it." "I know you will," she said. "That's partly why I set it up through legal aid." "You think several moves ahead," James said. "You always have." She thought about that after they hung up. She had always thought several moves ahead. She had done it for Gerald, for the children, for the household, for 45 years of invisible management. The capacity had always been there. She had simply been pointing it in directions that didn't show her name on the outcome. She was pointing it differently now. Rosa called in March to tell her the case had settled. The woman she had been representing, a 53-year-old named Carla who had spent 28 years managing the household and social world of a man who owned 4 commercial properties in Queens, had received a settlement that reflected fully the value of her contribution to the acquisition and maintenance of those properties over nearly 3 decades. The legal argument had been detailed and required the kind of forensic work that the Evelyn Hale Fund had helped finance, and the outcome was, as Rosa described it, exactly what the evidence supported. "She cried," Rosa said, "in the conference room when we told her the number. She said she didn't know it was worth that much." Catherine thought about sitting in James's conference room in December, the previous December, the 1985 document on the table. "The work is always worth more than people think," she said. "The legal challenge is building a record that makes the worth visible." "That's what you've been teaching me," Rosa said. "That's what the cases teach," Catherine said. "I'm just the one who's already made the mistakes." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Do you ever regret how long it took? Like, do you think about the version where you found the 1977 letter on the kitchen table and said, 'No, I'm going to Columbia'?" Catherine sat for a moment with the question, as she had learned to sit with questions that deserved full consideration rather than quick answers. I think about her, she said finally. The woman who might have gone in 1977. I think about her sometimes. She would have had a different life. Some better parts, some worse parts. She would not have had Michael and Elise or not those specific people who are not replaceable. She paused. But I try not to live in the version where I chose differently. I live in this one. This one has the settlement in Brooklyn Heights in Columbia and the Evelyn Hale Fund and a forensic accountant who wants to go into business with me. It's not the worst version. It's a good version, Rosa said. It is, Catherine agreed. It took a long time to get here. But the here is good. Rosa brought her a case in April. Not the way she usually brought things to Catherine. Not by phone or email for advice. She appeared at the coffee shop in the West Village on a Tuesday afternoon with a woman she introduced as Sandra Kowalski, 58 years old, a former elementary school art teacher who had stopped teaching when her children were born and had not gone back, and whose husband of 31 years had, 3 weeks earlier, informed her that he would be filing for divorce. Sandra was composed in the way of someone who has not yet processed what is happening to them, whose composure is the temporary kind that arrives before the understanding fully lands. She was small, with careful hands that she kept folded in her lap, and she looked at Catherine with the expression of someone who has been told that this person can help and is not yet sure she believes it. Rosa says you've been through something similar, Sandra said. I have, Catherine said. Did you know it was coming? I suspected. I spent 7 months confirming before I acted. Sandra nodded slowly. I didn't suspect. He just said it, over dinner, and I had nothing prepared. I signed things years ago that I didn't fully understand. I think I may have given up things I didn't know I was giving up. Catherine thought about 1988. The kitchen table. The 17-page reorganization. Her 4-year-old on the floor. Tell me what you signed, she said. As much as you can remember. Sandra told her. It took 40 minutes and it was specific and detailed in the way that people are specific and detailed when they have spent 3 weeks going over something in their heads and the information has been worn smooth with handling. Catherine listened without interrupting. She took notes on the small pad she kept in her bag, the same way she had kept notes in James Whitfield's conference room, the same way she had kept notes in Miss Creighton's library at 12, writing down what mattered and leaving space beside it for what the written thing connected to. When Sandra finished, Catherine looked at her notes for a moment. The documents you signed when his consulting practice was incorporated, she said. You mentioned that your name was on the original filing. I think so, Sandra said. He said it was a formality. Tax purposes. Do you have those documents? I don't know. Maybe in storage somewhere. We have a unit in New Jersey. I'd like you to look, Catherine said. Very carefully. Everything from the first year the practice was formed. Anything with your signature. Sandra looked at her with the particular quality of attention that comes when someone says something that lands differently than everything else that has been said in 3 weeks of being told things. Why does that matter? She asked. Because your name on a founding document is not a formality, Catherine said. Your name on a founding document is a legal fact that doesn't disappear just because someone tells you it does. Rosa, sitting quietly to the side, had her pen out. Sandra's folded hands opened slightly on the table, and she looked at Catherine with something that was not yet hope, but was adjacent to it, the first loosening of the composure that had been holding everything in place. I didn't know that, she said. I know, Catherine said. I didn't know it either for a long time. She sat with Sandra for another hour, going through the outline of what the next steps looked like. She was careful not to promise outcomes she couldn't guarantee and careful not to minimize what the process would require. She told her about Patricia. She told her about the Evelyn Hale Fund and what it could cover. She did not tell her own story in detail, because this meeting was not about her story. It was about Sandra's, which was just beginning to be told in the way it needed to be told. When they left, Rosa walked out with her to the sidewalk and stood for a moment in the April sun. That, Rosa said, is why I brought her to you. Find those documents, Catherine said. If her name is on the founding papers, this case changes shape. I know, Rosa said. I knew it before I found her. I've been listening to you for 4 months. That evening Catherine sat on the roof deck in the April warmth and thought about Sandra Kowalski driving back to New Jersey, and the storage unit, and the boxes of documents from 31 years of marriage that may or may not contain the thing that would change the shape of her case. She knew exactly what it felt like to be in the storage unit. The fluorescent light. The concrete floor. The box with your own name on documents that were supposed to be yours and had been quietly, carefully arranged to look like something else. She hoped Sandra's box had what she was looking for. She knew what it meant if it did. She opened her contracts textbook and worked until 10, and then she closed it and poured herself a glass of wine and sat with the bridge visible at the right corner and the lights of the city doing what they always did. And she was quiet for a while with the full texture of the day, which was considerable. In June she wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific. She had been asked by the Columbia program to contribute something to their new student orientation materials, something from the executive cohort's perspective on the experience of returning to formal education after a long interruption. She had said yes and had then spent 2 weeks trying to write something that was true rather than something that sounded right. The version she finally submitted began this way. When I was 22, I was accepted to this school and did not come. I made a choice that was also a consequence of expectations I had absorbed without examining them, and I told myself a story about that choice for 45 years that was true in parts and not the whole truth. This is a letter about what it costs to come back for what you didn't take when it was offered, and also about why it is worth the cost. The cost is that you arrive knowing how long you waited. You sit in a room with people who are younger or who started earlier or who didn't defer, and you are aware, in a way they are not, of everything that happened in the years between the offer and the acceptance. That awareness is not comfortable. I would not describe the experience of coming here at 67 as triumphant. It is not triumphant. It is honest, which is a different and more durable thing. The worth is this: everything you lived in the years between the offer and the acceptance you bring into the room with you. The specific weight of a specific life. The forensic accountant who spent 9 weeks tracing the financial history of your marriage. The judge who read a 17-page reorganization agreement and understood exactly what it had been designed to do. The woman in a coffee shop with careful hands folded in her lap who doesn't yet know that her name on a document is a legal fact. You bring all of it. You bring it to every case you read and every principle you examine and every conversation you have in this building about what the law is for and what it should do for the people inside it. That is the return on the deferral. Not the credential. The understanding. Come with everything you have lived. The room is better for it. She read it over once. Then she sent it before she could revise it further, which was what revision was sometimes for. The certificate ceremony was in August, on a Tuesday morning, 14 months after her first day of class. The room held the same 17 people, somewhat changed by the year, all of them finishing something. Elise was there. Michael had driven down from Portland the previous evening, and was sitting beside her with the slightly formal posture of a man who is trying to be unobtrusive in an unfamiliar setting, and is not entirely succeeding. Victor Osei sat next to Catherine in the ceremony row, as he had on the first day, and they were quiet together with the comfortable silence of people who have spent a year in the same room working hard at the same things. When she walked to the front to accept the certificate, she heard Elise, from the third row, say something under her breath that she couldn't quite make out. She looked out at the room for a moment before she stepped back, at the 17 people in the row and the family members in the chairs behind them, and the morning light coming through the windows of this building she had finally entered in the year she turned 67. She had the original Columbia acceptance letter in the inside pocket of her jacket. The 1977 one, cream envelope, her parents' address in Millhaven. She had put it there that morning without entirely deciding to, the way you carry certain things without having a precise reason, because they belong with you for this particular occasion. She did not take it out. She didn't need to. Afterward, on the steps, Michael put his arm around her and said, "Mom, I am genuinely impressed," which was the highest form of praise in his vocabulary and which he gave rarely and sincerely, and she accepted it the way she had been learning to accept things, without deflection, without the old reflex of minimizing, without the story that said someone else deserved the credit or the moment was not really hers. It was hers. The morning was hers. The certificate was hers. The Evelyn Hale Fund and the Brooklyn Heights apartment and the roof deck and the bridge were hers. The 40% of a company founded in 1985 on her grandmother's land, and the settlement that had made visible what had been invisible for 40 years, and the offer from Patricia Ing that she had called about in March and which she had said yes to, beginning in September. All of it was hers. Not because Gerald had given it to her. Not because a judge had awarded it to her. Not because Mrs. Blackwell or any other benefactor had recognized her worth and decided she deserved better. Because she had known the value of things eventually, and had been willing to stand in a room and say so. Her grandmother would have called that practical. Catherine was inclined to call it the same thing. The word for it was not brave and not triumphant and not the language of any of the stories she had told herself for 45 years about why things had turned out the way they had. The word for it was awake. She had been asleep for a long time, and then she had woken up and then she had done the work. The work was ongoing. It would keep being ongoing. Sandra Kowalski's case was in its early stages, and Rosa had 2 more in the pipeline who would need what the Evelyn Hale Fund provided. And Columbia was asking whether she would consider a guest lecture in the spring on the practical dimensions of financial discovery in long-term marriage cases, and Patricia had a client coming in on Thursday morning who had been handed documents at a kitchen table 22 years ago, and had signed them without an attorney because she trusted her husband. Catherine had her notes ready. She knew exactly what to ask. She knew where to look. The settlement check arrived on a Wednesday morning in May, transferred electronically to the account Sarah Chun had established for that purpose, and the notification arrived on Catherine's phone while she was standing at the kitchen counter in Brooklyn Heights drinking her first cup of coffee. She looked at the notification for a moment. Then she set her phone face down on the counter and finished the coffee. She had expected to feel something large when it arrived. Something proportional to the number, to the 45 years, to the weight of the proceedings and the long accumulation of what had been taken and recovered. What she felt instead was quieter than that and in its way more honest. A settling like a level finding its line after a long period of being tilted. She washed the cup. She got her bag and her notebook. She walked to the subway and rode it to Columbia and sat in her contract law seminar and spent 2 hours discussing the doctrine of unconscionability, which the law applies to agreements so one-sided that enforcing them would offend basic fairness, and which requires for its application that a court first see the agreement clearly for what it is. That evening she called Sarah and told her the funds had arrived and asked her to begin the process of establishing the Evelyn Hale Fund's initial endowment. The call took 11 minutes. Then she made dinner, a simple one, pasta with olive oil and the last of the summer tomatoes from the farmer's market on Atlantic Avenue, and she ate it at the kitchen table with a book open beside her plate. It was, she thought, the most ordinary evening she could remember. No obligation driving the menu, no one else's preference shaping the hour. Just her and the food she had chosen, and the book, and the quiet of an apartment that was entirely hers. She thought, so this is what it feels like. Victor Osei made the observation in October, over coffee after their legal structures seminar, that their cohort had a quality he had not encountered in any professional training he'd done before. We don't argue about whether something matters, he said. We argue about how much. Catherine thought about that. The seminar that day had been a discussion of equitable distribution principles, and the argument had been precise and sometimes heated and completely grounded, because every person in that room had either lived the consequences of those principles or spent a career watching others live them. Younger students argue the theory, she said. We're arguing the application. We're arguing from inside the outcomes, Victor said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a surgeon's habit, she had noticed, the constant subtle assessment of the thing held. I had a patient years ago who sued the hospital after a procedure. I knew the procedure was correct. The outcome was bad, but the procedure was correct, and the law as I understood it would see it that way. He paused. The law did. He lost. But reading that case now, the legal reasoning is right and something else is wrong, and I couldn't have told you what the something else was before I started this program. What is it? The record, Victor said. The record captures what happened but not what it cost to the person it happened to. The law reads the record and the person is somewhere beneath it, present but not visible. Catherine thought about Patricia's spreadsheets. Gerald's financial history laid out in columns. Assets, dates, valuations, transfer amounts. The record of a marriage in numbers. Accurate, complete, and missing the thing that couldn't be entered into a cell. The 45 years of daily presence that made the numbers possible in the first place. The contracts professor says the law is a record-keeping system, Catherine said. What gets written down is what gets seen. Then the work, Victor said, is making sure the right things get written down. Yes, she said. That's exactly what the work is. They walked out of the building together into the October afternoon and went their separate ways, and Catherine thought about that conversation for the rest of the week, the way she thought about the things that named something she had been carrying without words. She had spent 45 years not in the record. Not absent from the life, but absent from the document. Invisible in the way that things are invisible when no one is writing them down. She was writing things down now. Her own cases, her notes from Rose's consultations, the legal pad she kept beside her coffee cup in the mornings where she worked through problems from the seminar that hadn't finished resolving in class. She wrote things down because she had learned what it costs not to, and because the things she wrote down were, finally, about her own work and her own understanding and no one else's. Patricia's first consultation with a shared client happened on a Thursday in September, the first week of what they had agreed to call, provisionally, Ing and Preston Financial Consulting, which was not yet a formally registered entity but was a working arrangement between two people who had decided their skills fit together usefully. The client was a woman named Irene, 60 years old, who had been married for 34 years to a man who owned a small chain of dry cleaning businesses in Queens and who had, Patricia's preliminary review suggested, been restructuring ownership of those businesses through a series of family trusts over the preceding 3 years in ways that would substantially reduce the marital estate. Catherine and Patricia sat with Irene in Patricia's conference room and worked through what Irene remembered. The documents she'd signed, the conversations she'd had, the years of bookkeeping she'd done for the businesses before the children were born, and the operational work had been handed off to a manager. Irene was methodical and had a memory for numbers that Catherine recognized immediately as the memory of someone who had spent years managing accounts and had never lost the habit of holding figures accurately. "You did the books," Catherine said. "For how long?" 11 years, Irene said. "Before Marcus hired the accountant. Do you have any of those records?" "I kept copies," Irene said with a slight defensiveness, as if she expected to be told this was unnecessary or excessive. "Good," Catherine said. "That was the right instinct. Those records document your contribution to the operational history of the businesses. That contribution has legal standing. Patricia is going to want to review everything you have." Irene looked at Patricia, then back at Catherine. "My sister said you went through something like this," she said. "I did. Did you know what you were doing when you were going through it?" Catherine thought about the storage unit, the fluorescent light, the original Incorporation document, and her name on the founding line. "Not at the beginning," she said. "I learned as I went. That's partly why I'm here now, so that you can know more at the beginning than I did." Irene nodded. Her hands, folded on the conference table, had the same careful stillness as Sandra Kowalski's had, the posture of someone who has been holding themselves together and is now, in this room, beginning to consider that they don't have to do it entirely alone. "What do I do first?" Irene asked. "First," Catherine said, "you tell us everything you remember. All of it. The details that seem too small to matter are often the ones that matter most." Irene took a breath and began. Catherine walked home from Patricia's office that evening. Long walk, 40 minutes through streets that were still warm with the last of summer. She walked without her phone in her hand, which was a habit she had been building, the practice of being in the hour without dividing it. The city moved around her, indifferent and specific, the way it always was, the way she had lived in it for 45 years without ever entirely belonging to it on her own terms. She belonged to it now. This particular street at this particular hour, the light coming low between buildings, a woman walking home from work she had chosen and that had chosen her back. She thought about Irene's hands on the table. Sandra's before her. The particular stillness of women at the beginning of a process that will require them to look directly at what has been done and name it clearly. She had sat in that stillness herself, in James Whitfield's waiting room, on the morning everything changed. She knew what it took to arrive there and what it took to stay. She would be back in that conference room on Tuesday. She had notes to prepare. She turned onto Atlantic Avenue and walked the last 4 blocks to the brownstone and took the stairs to the 3rd floor and unlocked the door to her apartment, which was full of the particular amber light that came through the west-facing windows in the early evening. She stood in the doorway for a moment, as she sometimes did, not from hesitation but from the habit of noticing. The books on the shelves finally out of boxes. the quilt folded on the window seat. Her grandmother's chest set on the side table by the garden doors, which were actually windows, but which she had taken to calling garden doors because they faced the small courtyard below, and in her mind they opened onto something larger than they did. Her notes were on the kitchen table. Her coffee cup from this morning, rinsed and upturned on the drying rack. The quiet of a home that held only her own order, her own accumulation, her own preferences expressed in every arrangement. This was the thing that was hardest to explain to people who asked how she was doing, which they asked often, with the mixture of concern and curiosity that attends a woman who has undergone a visible and significant change in her circumstances. They expected her to locate the improvement in the settlement, in the money, in the legal vindication. Those things mattered. They were not the main thing. The main thing was this: the apartment at the end of the day, her notes on the table, the light through the west-facing windows, the complete absence of the need to be anyone other than who she was. She put her bag down. She opened her notes. She went to work. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.